I guess I'll just start. Welcome to this session of the Virtual Medieval Academy of America. This is Manuscripts, Documents, and Space. And our speakers today are, sorry, I have too many different notes. Helen Fulton of University of Bristol, Adam Matthews of Columbia University, and Jonathan Dell'Isola of the Catholic University of America. I would like to remind attendees of the professional behavior policy, which is on the Medieval Academy of America's website. If you're not familiar with that, do familiarize yourself. It seems there have been some problems in the sessions yesterday. So for today, there will not be any Q&A function for you guys, no hand raising or chat, that's all turned off. So if you have any questions, and I see Christopher's already add my email address to the chat. My email address is there. It's Myriah@berkeley.edu. So if you have any questions for our speakers, please send them to me throughout and we'll ask those at the end. I'll ask them for you. Okay. Everyone's papers are 20 to 25 minutes today, and I was going to say we'll be done 10:30 Pacific time, but that's different for everyone else, of course. Okay, that's all for me. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Helen Fulton, again, of the University of Bristol. She is professor of medieval literature, and her main research area is the literary connections between medieval Welsh and English literatures, with a focus on the urban and political aspects of literary texts and manuscript mobility. She has published widely in this area and is currently editing a collection of medieval Welsh political poetry. She is the co-editor of the Cambridge History of Welsh Literature. Welcome, thanks.
Thank you very much, Myriah, and many thanks to the Medieval Academy for making it possible to give our papers in this way. I know it's a real shame that we couldn't all meet in person, but it's very nice to be here virtually anyway. So my paper today is about a really interesting man who I think is very under-considered in medieval literary studies, a man called Sir John Prise, who lived in the first half of the 16th century, which may seem a little out of our period. But it's because he was responsible for the transmission of many medieval manuscripts from the sort of late Middle Ages through to the Reformation that I'm interested in him. So my paper belongs to the broad area of book history or manuscript history, and that huge transfer of knowledge from the Middle Ages through to the early modern period that happened around the time of the dissolution of the monasteries. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my PowerPoint presentation, and I hope that that will be okay for everybody and that you'll be able to see it as well as see me talking at the same time. So my paper is about the nature and the importance of the collection of manuscripts made by this chap, Sir John Prise, and also his own writing, and the focus that he made on medieval British history, which he was particularly interested in. And of course, that interest in medieval British history was very symptomatic of his time, part of a larger debate that had been in progress since Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae was published in about 1138. And of course, there were many comments at the time that Geoffrey's Historia came out by some of his contemporaries and later historians, people like William of Malmesbury and Ranulph Higden in the 14th century, expressing a certain amount of skepticism about some aspects of Geoffrey's history. And that was a debate that was still very live in the early 16th century and became crucial to the Tudor formation of a kind of attitude to what was British history in order to appropriate it for a new kind of English history. Oh, sorry, I'm just trying to move the next slide along. Okay, there we go. So this is a slide of what were called the Marcher Lordships of Wales on the borders of Wales. And this was very much the territory that Sir John Prise lived and worked in. So the March of Wales refers to this borderland between Wales and England, and it mostly encompasses the estates of the Marcher lords along the eastern border with England. You can see all the little divisions into these estates going from north to south and then out to the west of Wales. Many of these estates straddled the modern political border, so they actually included part of what became the English counties after 1536, especially around Herefordshire and Shropshire. You can just see to the east of the map, on the far right of the map. So we have a sort of continuity of literary production along the march from at least the 12th century right through until the 16th and even 17th centuries. And we know that there was a thriving industry of manuscript production on both sides of the border in the late Middle Ages. So manuscripts and works in Latin, English, French, and Welsh were produced in this area and kept in the monastic houses, and also in a number of gentry libraries, the libraries of a number of gentry households that set up their own libraries from around the 14th century. Then with the Acts of Union in 1536, the marcher lordships were abolished and replaced with the more familiar English counties, places like Flint, Denbigh, Montgomery, Radnor, Brecknock, Monmouth, and so on. And so Wales was incorporated into English government and was divided into these English shires. So that was the map of Wales around the time of Sir John Price's life. So Sir John Prise, or John Prise, was born in about 1501 or 1502 in Brecon on the March of Wales. He was the son of a local Welsh gentry family, and he was known as John, or his Welsh name was Siôn ap Rhys, which gave the name Prise, which became the English form Price. So Siôn ap Rhys, Sir John Prise, Sir John Price, a number of different ways of saying his name. He studied law at Oxford, where some of his contemporaries were later his colleagues as royal commissioners, the men who were sent by Henry VIII to visit the monasteries, decide what was there, make a list of what was there, make sure anything valuable went to Henry, went to the king's property, and then to close the monasteries down, dissolve the monasteries. So by 1530, John Prise was working for Thomas Cromwell, and therefore indirectly for Henry VIII. He was present at the king's marriage to Anne Boleyn in 1533, and in the following year he married Joan Williamson, who was a niece of Cromwell's wife, Elizabeth. And any of you who've been reading the novels by Hilary Mantel, Wolf Hall, Bring Up the Bodies, and now her third one, The Mirror and the Light, will be very familiar with this period of history that is the lifetime of Sir John Prise. So Sir John was a commissioner for receiving the dissolved monastic lands and property on many of the monasteries along the marches and in southwest England between about 1537 and 1539. The monasteries he visited included places like Cirencester, Evesham, St. Augustine's Abbey in Bristol, St. Peter's Abbey in Gloucester, Worcester Cathedral, Malmesbury, Neath Abbey, Brecon Priory, St. Guthlac's in Hereford, and Tewkesbury Abbey. And he did many of these in a single journey from December 1538 to January 1539, accompanied by a team of 4 or 5 others whose job was to close down the monasteries. And on these journeys, he took the opportunity to retrieve the manuscripts that were of interest to him from the monastic libraries. And I want to say that he wasn't just some kind of plunderer. He was actually rescuing manuscripts which would otherwise just have been destroyed, torn up, sold off for scrap, the paper or the vellum used again for something else, used to bind other books, or simply burnt or destroyed in some other way. So he was actually responsible for preserving manuscripts that otherwise would have been destroyed. So he built up a library of over 100 books and was responsible for saving many of the monastic books and manuscripts, and so providing us with very useful evidence about literary production on the march and in southwest England. So his collection helps us to create a sense of what was the regional cultural history of the marches and southwest Britain. In later life, after 1540, he managed to escape the fate that befell Thomas Cromwell, who fell out of Henry's favour and was himself executed in July 1540. But Sir John Prise managed to escape that purge. He had strategically acquired property in Hereford the former St. Guthlac's Priory, which became his permanent home, and from where he acquired some of his manuscripts. And in that same year, in 1540, he was appointed secretary to the Council of the Marches, and that was a position that he held until his death in 1555. Sir John bought Brecon Priory in 1542. These are some photos of Brecon Priory. In the early 20th century, it became an Anglican cathedral, so it's now a Brecon Cathedral, but for many years it was a priory. And Sir John bought this building in 1542, mainly to preserve it, not to live in it. And then he was knighted by Edward VI in 1547 and held a number of other offices in that region of the Welsh Marches. He was Justice of the Peace, Member of Parliament, and so on. Given this immense transfer of European knowledge, classical and medieval, that took place at the Reformation with all its consequences for Tudor intellectual history, the relative critical neglect of the contribution made by Sir John Prise is remarkable, and it's something I'm working on now, trying to rectify this loss of reputation and trying to restore the reputation of Sir John Prise, who was a tremendously influential figure. Most of the scholarly work on the dissolution has focused on other collectors of manuscripts, especially John Leland, John Bale, and Robert Talbot, three contemporaries or near contemporaries of Prise. John Leland is probably the best known of these, of course. He was almost an exact contemporary of Prise's. He was born in London. He became a royal chaplain. He worked for Archbishop Cranmer, and of course he knew John Prise. Leland was among the early visitors to the monasteries on behalf of the Crown from the early 1530s, but wasn't himself a commissioner who took part in the dissolution. He certainly compiled long lists of the books in the monastic libraries, but that was mainly to identify the luxury manuscripts, which he then carted off to Henry VIII's royal collections. So Leland was part of a circle of antiquarians and collectors, but there's no evidence that he saved any of the books from the monastic libraries, as John Prise did, apart from the ones that he took away to form part of Henry VIII's libraries. So Prise, I think, has been largely overlooked, perhaps because his area of operations was in the west of Britain, and perhaps also because he was Welsh and not seen as part of that circle of very English antiquarians like Leland and Bale. But Prise's collection of manuscripts and early printed books retrieved from the monastic houses on the March of Wales is invaluable as a record of what was in these libraries, what was preserved from earlier centuries. Many of the manuscripts are annotated in his own hand. At his death, he bequeathed his theological books to Hereford Cathedral Library, where most of them still are. He bequeathed his literary manuscripts to Thomas Vaughan of Glamorgan, a big Welsh gentry family. And he left his historical manuscripts containing histories and chronicles to his son, Richard, asking him to make sure that at least some of them were published, that is, published in print. Sir John was an early adopter of print technology. He was a great believer in making knowledge available in print so that it would last. So by 1600, 50 years after his death, his collection was scattered fairly widely, and much of it was donated to libraries by other antiquarians. A substantial part of the collection is now at Jesus College, Oxford, having been left to the college by Prise's eldest son, Gregory. And there are a few more at other Oxford and Cambridge College libraries, the British Library and the National Library of Wales. But we don't know the entire extent of Prise's collection. We know quite a lot about it, as a preliminary catalogue of the collection was made in the mid-20th century by the great manuscript scholar Neil Kerr, and he published his preliminary catalogue in an article in the journal called The Library. But Kerr himself acknowledged that many manuscripts which had once belonged to John Prise or which had passed through his hands, especially those not now surviving at Hereford or Jesus College, were lost or unknown. This is what Kerr said in his article: Prise's manuscripts bearing on the history and antiquities of England and Wales, or at least those which he used, for he may not have owned them all, are for the most part to be found only because they bear notes in his hand in the margins. anyone wishing to make a complete list would have to search, knowing his hand, through all the likely books looking for his marginalia. And this is a project which I have in hand with some colleagues. We're trying to put together a digital catalogue of Priest's complete collection as far as we can find it. Just to give you an example of Priest's handwriting, those are some of his marginalia on the right-hand side. His annotations here in a 12th century manuscript of Bede's Historia Ecclesiastica, a manuscript which is now in the Bodleian Library, but it was one of many copies of Bede that Sir John Prise owned in his own collection. And in fact, a new manuscript written in Priest's hand has turned up very recently, towards the end of 2019, in the Northamptonshire Record Office. So one of these county record offices in Britain, which happen to have a few medieval manuscripts in their collection, often not quite sure what they are. This one was accidentally turned up, and it is written in the hand of Sir John Prise. And this is a photograph of the top corner of that manuscript, Northamptonshire Record Office FH7. And it's written in Welsh. At the top it says, "I took this from an old book which I got from Griffith Hiraethog when it was the year of Christ 1550, so not long before Sir John Prise died." And the contents seem to be an example of Priest's interest in British history, particularly Arthurian history. So he recounts the list of Arthur's battles and how many years elapsed between different events in Arthur's life. So for example, he says there were 22 years between the Battle of Badon and the Battle of Camlan, where Arthur was killed. And in this section, he says from Gwrthén Gwrtheni, which is Vortigern, to the Battle of Badon, where Arthur fought with the Saxons and Arthur prevailed. So it's like a copy or a paraphrase of the reference to Arthur in the Annales Cambriae. There were a number of works written by Prise himself. He was a writer as well as a collector and annotator. And there are 3 surviving works written by him in a mixture of Welsh, English, and Latin. The first one, his Commonplace Book, is almost entirely in Welsh and in his own handwriting. And it dates from his early career at Henry's court in about 1535. It was the year when his first child was born, and he evidently set up the Commonplace Book thinking that he would record details about his children. So the book is laid out alphabetically with 6 pages assigned to each letter, but many of the pages have been left blank. And later on, he used the book to copy out a number of Welsh proverbs and sayings, some comments on grammar and metre, and a large collection of Welsh poems, including some of the poems that were addressed to him by a number of the Welsh bards who were still composing praise poetry to patrons among the Welsh gentry. And the poets who sang to him included Lewis Morgannwg, Griffith Hiraethog, and Thomas Vaughan of Lywes in Powys. So a number of the leading poets of the day composed praise poetry to Sir John Prise in Welsh. The Commonplace Book survives in Balliol College Library, manuscript 353, and it's been photographed and placed online, so it's not properly digitized, but it is a photographic record of the manuscript. And the Commonplace Book contains things like this list of Welsh triads. So on this page, there are a number of triads, including 3 things an Irishman loves, 3 things a Welshman loves, 3 things a Frenchman loves, 3 things an Englishman loves. So anyone who thinks that nationalism is a modern idea, then it's clear from these triads that people were already thinking in terms of national characteristics. Going back to the books that he wrote, his second book, Untitled Chapter, it hasn't got a formal title, so it's normally referred to by the first few words of its opening sentence, Untitled Chapter, in this book. Prise was convinced that if people had access to religious text in their own language, it would help to educate them and make them better Christians. So he actually anticipated the later Protestant view of the importance of the vernacular languages for the improvement of religious instruction. So in this book, Prise translated the Creed, the Lord's Prayer, and the Ten Commandments into Welsh, the earliest translations of these to be printed, and this was the first book ever to be printed in the Welsh language. Prise took the precaution of adding in a few secular items also in Welsh, such as a calendar of husbandry showing the best times for harvesting and sowing and so on, so that his book would be useful for the agricultural communities of Wales. So the book contained useful agricultural information and a little bit of religious instruction on the side, as it were. The third book on the list is Prise's masterpiece. Written entirely in Latin, the book is a strong defence of the version of British history recorded by Geoffrey of Monmouth, in which Geoffrey listed a line of the kings of Britain, from the first one, Brutus, descendant of the Trojans, to the last one, Cadwallader, before the British were violently dispossessed by the incoming Saxons and the line of English kings began. Geoffrey's account, of course, had been accepted with some minor reservations as the official history of Britain before the English arrived. But it was challenged very comprehensively in 1534 by an Italian writer who had settled in London and who had been commissioned by Henry VII to write a history of England. Polydore Virgil's Anglica Historia, English history, was finally published in 1534 and cast considerable doubt on Geoffrey's version of history, including the existence of King Arthur, whom Geoffrey had particularly praised as the greatest king of the British people of all time. So Prise wrote a defence of Geoffrey called Historiae Britannicae Defensio, a defence of the British history. He finished it in about 1550, but it wasn't published until well after his death in 1573. Like John Leland, who had also published a defence of Geoffrey of Monmouth in 1544, Prise was stimulated by a desire to restore King Arthur to his proper status as a historical king, drawing on all the evidence he could find in the early Welsh tradition. Prise's evidence came almost entirely from the manuscripts that he had collected in his own possession. So manuscripts like the 9th century Historia Britonum of Nennius. And from these manuscripts, Prise was able to make the case that Arthur was known about by historians writing long before Geoffrey of Monmouth. So therefore, he argued, Geoffrey's history wasn't a fabrication and Arthur must have really existed. Certainly a flawed argument, but he made a good case, like the good lawyer that he was. So Prise's Defensio is also a very good guide to the manuscripts that Prise owned, because he refers to other manuscripts very often in this book, and he refers to many which are now lost or unknown, like his copy of William of Malmesbury's Gesta Regum Anglorum, Deeds of the English Kings of 1125, and Henry of Huntingdon's Historia Anglorum, History of the English People, which was written somewhere between 1129 and 1154. These items are both mentioned in Prise's will. They were two of the ones that he asked his son Richard to publish after his death. So Prise's interest in British history was stimulated by Polydore Virgil's book. In his travels around the monasteries of the Southwest and the March, Prise kept a particular lookout for books of British history, and he used these as evidence in the case he built up in his Defensio. He owned a copy of Higden's Polychronicon, which had come from Gloucester, now in Corpus Christi College, Oxford. He also owned a copy of the Historia Britonum, which had come from Brecon Priory. This was one of his particular treasures. At that time, the Historia Britonum was thought to have been written by Gildas, the 6th century historian, but now, of course, thought to be by Nennius, a 9th century churchman from North Wales. Also from Brecon Priory, he rescued a rare 12th century copy of the Latin lives of Welsh saints, Vitae Sanctorum Waliae, now in the British Library, Cotton Vespasian A14. He owned several copies of Bede's Historia Ecclesiastica and other writing, and he owned what is now the sole surviving copy of Gerald of Wales's Symbolum Electorum, which is a compilation of some of the letters and poems and extracts from Gerald's own writing. And that manuscript came from the Franciscan convent at Hereford, and it's now in Trinity College, Cambridge. Prise was also interested in Welsh literature, and we know that two of the most significant anthologies of Welsh literature, the Black Book of Carmarthen and the Red Book of Hairguest, passed through his hands, possibly on its way along the marches from Glamorgan, where it was compiled, to the household of the Vaughan family at Hairguest. And the Red Book of Hairguest has significant marginal annotations in Price's hand. And we have to think that the large body of Welsh literature that we have surviving in the Red Book and the Black Book may not have survived at all if Prise hadn't had the manuscripts in his possession and passed them on to Welsh gentry families. Prise also refers intriguingly to a Liber Britannicus, a British book in his possession, which was very likely one of the Welsh versions of Geoffrey's History of the Kings of Britain, though the manuscript is unknown at this time, perhaps a mystery that we might be able to solve in our project. So a number of Price's works of history are now in the National Library of Wales, the British Library and the Bodleian Library, and they're identifiable mainly by these annotations in Price's hand. So I'll move to my conclusion, which is to talk about the importance of Price's collection, which offers vital information, adding to our understanding of Reformation culture in this particular region of Britain. And I want to emphasize that I'm interested in the sort of regional cultural history of where Price was operating along the marches and the southwest of England. And I think his collection is important for four main reasons. Firstly, the collection evidences the preservation of Welsh literary culture among the Marcher gentry on both sides of the border. And as a Welsh speaker, Prise was ideally placed to recognise the importance of, particularly of Welsh manuscripts, that he came across in his work and travels, and to ensure that they were safely housed after the dissolution. Secondly, the collection provides an overview of the type of books and manuscripts that had been held in monastic libraries immediately before the dissolution. And we get a sense of that canon of the essential texts of classical and medieval theology and history that monastic libraries had on their shelves. And we get a strong sense of the continuity of literary production from the Middle Ages into the early modern period, and of that major process of knowledge transfer that occurred across the dividing line of the Reformation. Thirdly, Price's collection defines a specific intellectual context in which histories written by English historians were being pressed into the service of the nation-building agenda of the Tudor monarchs. Polydore Virgil's History of England had been originally commissioned by Henry VII in about 1505, though it wasn't published until 1534. And it accelerated an earlier process of undermining the traditional history of the British people, which Prise and his contemporaries insisted was authentic. Finally, Price's collection provides a compelling insight into the scholarship of a truly Renaissance man, a humanist and antiquarian, whose main scholarly impulse was towards the history and historiography of the British people, that is, the Welsh. There may be further evidence to be uncovered through an investigation of the full list of manuscripts that passed through Price's hands, evidence that might tell us more about Price's worldview, especially his religious positioning. As a humanist who followed the teachings of Erasmus, and as a loyal servant of the crown, Prise seemed to have no difficulty in supporting first the anti-papism of Henry VIII, and then the full-scale return to Catholicism enacted by Queen Mary, who repealed Henry's Act of Supremacy and reverted to the Pope. So in his desire to preserve the past, Prise showed a commitment to salvaging medieval Catholic texts at a time when such an activity could have been dangerous. But he survived, and so did most of his collection. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. That was very interesting. We're going to take questions at the end. Again, if you have any questions for Helen or for any of our other speakers upcoming, please send me an email, and that's been provided in the chat. So we're going to turn now to Adam Matthews of Columbia University, who's going to be telling us about the making of a sanctuary, church consecration, and the functionality of sacred space in Post-Carolingian Catalonia, 850 to 1100. Adam is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at Columbia. In his forthcoming dissertation, Sacred Space and Legal Practice in Catalonia and Southern France, 850 to 1100, he examines the legal, documentary, and liturgical practices of the lands adhering to Visigothic law. He received a Bachelor of Arts from Wittenberg University and a Master of Arts from Western Michigan University in 2013. Okay, thank you. Welcome, and thank you, Adam.
Hi, thank you. I'm trying to share the full screen of my presentation, but the bar telling me I'm sharing my screen is hiding that. How do I move the bar? Move to bottom. Okay, thank you. Got it. Thank you for that introduction. Hopefully my screen is now visible. I'm going to speak today about the role of the documentary record of the Spanish March, particularly documents of church consecration, to discussions of the nature of sacred space in the Carolingian religious reforms. So I'll go ahead and begin. Thank you. The narrative of the Carolingian religious reforms has profoundly affected how scholars view the coalescence of an institutionalized and hierarchical church in the Latin West. Under the patronage of rulers such as Charlemagne and Louis the Pious, the clerical elite of the Frankish world sought to solidify doctrine, standardize forms of worship, and create uniform belief across the empire in an effort to educate and moralize society. The liturgical commentators of the period hoped that devotees would take from the Mass a better understanding of the key principles of the faith, as well as their role, their personal role, in the Christian community. As an arena for liturgical display and edification, the place of worship itself, the church building, became central to this moralizing effort. It is not surprising, therefore, that the 9th and 10th century writers dedicated much attention to the nature and significance of these buildings in the form of ordines, or ritual instructions for the consecration of a church, and extended commentaries on this rite. Yet some scholars have cast doubts about the scope and impact of the larger reforms and their moralizing ambitions. Notably, John Catrini urged caution in seeking to determine how much of the intellectual movement reached the common laity. This raises questions concerning the significance of churches during this period. How effective was the effort to educate society through liturgical display? What role did church spaces have in that effort? Did the reformers succeed in communicating the meaning of specific acts, such as the consecration? One of the challenges scholars have faced in trying to address these questions is the absence of a broader range of source types. Ordines and associated liturgical commentaries tell us little about how the reform positions were received by rural communities celebrating the dedication of a new church. In this paper, I show that documentary sources can help to contextualize examinations of liturgical sources. I compare a well-circulated ordo and related commentary on the consecration rite with records of church dedication from the Spanish March, shown here at the bottom of the map. These documents are known as dotalia. Between the 9th and late 11th century, almost 300 such dotalia documents survive. Their creation corresponds to a surge in church construction during these centuries, as the Catalan frontier of the Spanish March extended southward. These sources show that the people of the March were less interested in what these church spaces meant, and more so in what they did for those praying within them. I argue that parishioners did not see worship centers as merely symbolic. Rather, they believed that the consecration ritual transformed the building into a sanctified zone, defined as a, quote, doorway to heaven, or a porta caeli, connecting the earthly realm to the kingdom of God. Praying before the altar, humans beseech saints to travel through the gateway in order to answer calls for intercession. Dotalia documents additionally show that the clergy of the March was not at odds with the perception of lay congregants. They saw churches in a similar fashion. By detailing an episode of church dedication below, it is my hope to encourage those interested in the Reform era liturgy to consider the value of documentary sources in these conversations. Before turning to this example, however, it is important to review how the reforming elite characterized churches. To do so, I highlight an important ordo for the consecration called Ordo ad Benedicandam Ecclesiam. Hereafter, I will refer to this as PRG 40. This text was likely composed in the first half of the 9th century and was widely disseminated in the 10th century as a component of the much-cited Romano-Germanic Pontifical. It represents one of many such instructional guides for the consecration that were incorporated into liturgical manuals for bishops. These are known as pontificals. A brief review of PRG 40 and the associated commentary on its contents, titled Quid Significant Duodecim Candelae, hereafter called Quid Significant, will shed light on how bishops might have performed the rite and what the reformers intended for a consecration to achieve from their perspective. Then, by examining pious expressions and events recorded in Dotalia records, we can see how the March's parishioners and clergy alike were far more concerned with what a consecration did than what it meant. I hope to thereby highlight the incongruence between the reformers' interpretation of and intent for the consecration ritual and how the laity and secular clergy understood these buildings to be navigable doorways into God's kingdom, into heaven. Reformers were not necessarily the writers of ordines. The exact purpose that Ordo authors ascribe to these ritual guides remains unclear because they often merely present instructions for the execution of the ritual rather than an exposition on the constituent actions. However, scholars such as Brian Repsher have urged us to view commentaries such as Quid Significant as keys to interpreting the intent and value of consecrations. Repsher argued that PRG 40 was intended to educate observers about the significance of churches as representations of the Christian community, forged through joint prayer. In this sense, the building's value was metaphorical, hearkening back to the writings of Augustine and Ambrose, who questioned the existence of specific sacred spaces distinct from other forms of space. For the author of Quid Significant, the actions described in PRG 40 are meant to symbolize the church's baptism, which should, in turn, encourage individual devotees to contemplate their own initiation into the Christian community. This interest on baptism as a source of unity was a key tenet of the reforms, as imperial authorities sought to incorporate new non-Christian peoples and bring peripheral regions into the Frankish sphere of influence. Thus, as Repsher describes it, from the perspective of the author of Quid Significant, the consecration rite was a manifestation of the broader reform agenda. Yet, did the Quid Significant commentator capture the intended purpose envisioned by the actual author of PRG 40? Moreover, did the expositor's interpretation match that of the congregants? A comparative examination of PRG 40 and Dotalia from the Spanish March suggests a negative. PRG 40 details 150 ritual actions. In his analysis, Repsher divided the steps into 4 stages based on the location where the actions occur, either inside or outside the building. Also, a good example of a church from this time and region can be seen in the slide here. It's a pretty well-preserved 9th century church. Throughout the ceremony, the consecration party consciously moves back and forth through the doors of the church. The laity, left waiting outside, do not witness over half of the rite. In fact, the bishop addresses the laity only once at the end, exhorting them to act respectfully in this space. At no point does the bishop communicate the reformer's position on the symbolism of the building, the centrality of the concept of the community to the faith, or the significance of baptism. Excuse me. What he does focus on, however, is the demarcation of sacred and mundane spaces. Each stage of the ritual attends to the specification of boundaries. The bishop distinguishes between the building's exterior and interior, cleansing each zone of demons so that he can then invoke divine power to sanctify the space. How space is cleansed depends on the proximity of the celebrants to the altar. Circling the building 3 times, the bishop asperses the walls with lustral waters, a mixture of salt and holy water. When the party enters the church in stage 2, the water must be changed for a version containing more powerful ingredients, this time wine and ash. Finally, the bishop anoints the altar with chrism oil, the holiest substance used. The changing of cleansing substances is necessitated by entry into progressively holier areas of space leading up to the altar. Inside the building, while lustrating the walls and drawing boundaries on the floor, the bishop lists biblical passages in which God descends from heaven onto earth. His prayers invite the repetition of this bridging of 2 realms. The attention to defining space leads me to question the educational value of the consecration rite. If the laity was the intended audience, they are absent for most of the ritual. If the author of PRG 40 intended this to be an instructional opportunity, its design ensured it was a missed one. What the rite really did accomplish was a transformation of space. The church became a gateway linking heaven and earth. Yet, if the ritual changed space, what was that space used for? As Michel Zimmerman has touched upon, Dotalia reveal that the laity and the presiding clergy of the Spanish March were interested in the functionality of churches as locales to secure salvation. To begin, a dotalium is the record of a multi-stage dedication event, of which the consecration is merely one part. As their purpose is not liturgical, these documents do not detail the rite's execution, the actual ceremony, and the steps of it. The events of a dotalium can be described as the following. 1, the invitation of the bishop. 2, a narration of the church's construction. 3, an expression of why the church was built. 4, the execution of the consecration itself. 5, the endowment of the church. 6, the establishment of the parish. 7, a statement of the church's inviolate nature. And 8, the witness list. The endowment and administrative sections are always the longest, and scribes prioritize property rights over religious matters. With mention of the consecration rite limited to a line or two, how can Dotalia explain conceptions of sacred space among marcher communities? These documents, while focused on temporal matters, frequently include expressions of piety relating directly to the function of the church, the establishment of a sacred ground on which the faithful could solicit saintly intercession. In contrast to the prominent position of bishops and ordinaries, Dotalia scribes depict prelates as passive actors. Only 12% of cases show bishops or abbots building the church. 59% show village communities jointly financing the construction and dedication. The remaining cases detail aristocratic foundations and cooperation between bishops and villagers. In cases in which lay villagers guide the action, founders and donors frequently reveal why they act. They explain the purpose of the church and what they hope to gain from worshiping there. An example is instructive, and here I have a map for you. In 890, Bishop Ingilbert of Urgé arrived at the village of Baltarga to consecrate a church built by the inhabitants in honor of Sant'Andreo. The scribe memorializes the villagers' conception of the church, what they believed they could gain by worshiping there, and how the church space was changed by merit of the consecration. It is also noteworthy that this dedication ended in a dispute and a conflict. This demonstrates that the people believed their very salvation depended on access to a legitimate sacred space. What we do not see, however, is mention of any educational value for the rite. Put simply, more was at stake than theological reflection. When Bishop Ingilbert arrived, his party was greeted by the inhabitants of Baltarga and the parishioners of a nearby church of Saint-Martin de Sai. Both locations are located on the map there. The scribe states, quote, all those men asked Bishop Ingilbert to consecrate their church in honor of God and Sant'Andreo. And then the laymen submitted and handed over the said church to the power of the Lord Bishop for the consecration. just as the Venerable Father stipulated and is ordained in the canons, so that, in the world to come, they shall receive an indulgence of their sins." End quote. The village assembly here lists its priorities, explaining how the church should be consecrated, what benefit comes from the transformation, and how the rite forges a sacred space. It is noteworthy that the people ask Engelbert to bless the church in accordance with the stipulations of the fathers and the canons. This suggests that parishioners expected the bishop to adhere to the norms for the rite's execution. It was important that this was done correctly. This shows that the villagers believed that the reification of a sacred space required precise performance of a ritual rather than ad hoc communication of symbolism behind the church. If we can trust the scribe of the Boltarga Dotalium to have faithfully reported what the assembled people said, then we are looking at a rural congregation that was well informed about what a consecration was and what the rite did. The intense lay concern for salvation suggests a preoccupation with the result of the ritual, the sacralization of sacred space of the church. Moreover, Dotalia scribes, overwhelmingly clerical in their vocation, did not seek to correct the laity or insert educational language into the documents. That the clergy consistently included and repeated the functional value in Dotalia suggests that it was a sentiment with which they agreed. The desire for salvation is also evident in the next section of the Boltarga Dotalium. Following the performance of the rite, locals endowed the new church. Each donor makes a statement explaining why he or she alienates an estate for, quote, the love of God. Then patrons state collectively, quote, "We give all that has been stated above to the noted church so that through the intercession of Sant Andreu, we and our relatives might merit to have pardon from God of our sins," end quote. This demonstrates that the impetus for building the church, consecrating it, and endowing it are the same: remission of sins. In order to obtain that forgiveness, a sacred space was necessary. Yet, how might we confirm that salvation was the central aim for the creation of sacred spaces, rather than mere lip service that scribes attributed to donors? We can find answers at the end of this Dotalium in a dispute that arose between the people of Boltarga and their neighbors from Sai. Following the endowments, Bishop Engelbert finally addressed one of the key features of the Dotalia, the establishment of the new parish and its administration. Often, in addition to listing the church's rights and allocation of tithes, this meant either submitting the new church to another parish already established, or making an established parish dependent on this new one being dedicated. The latter is what Engelbert set out to do at Boltarga, and this is where the trouble arose. The villagers from Sai, parishioners of the Church of Saint Marti, had been summoned to the dedication event by the bishop. At the conclusion of the ceremony, the bishop announced to the people of the two villages that he was folding the church at Sai into the newly constituted parish of Boltarga. Moreover, he appointed a priest named Alderic to care for the two communities. There is no indication that the inhabitants of either village opposed the consolidation. As far as they were concerned, they would still be paying the same amount in tithes and would continue to have access to a source of intercession, as Saint Marti of Sai would continue to operate as a church. It was only once the bishop jeopardized the efficient functioning of that dependent church that the people of Sai protested. Engelbert wanted the new priest Alderic to serve both sanctuaries, but Alderic could not be in two places at once. During his announcement, he stated that Alderic was to celebrate Mass daily at the Church of Boltarga. However, he was also expected to do the same at Sai. Engelbert clearly had not foreseen a problem, assuming that Alderic could effectively journey between the neighboring villages daily. Yet, where would Alderic maintain his primary residence? The scribe explains that a fight broke out between the parishioners over this very issue. Each community demanded that Alderic reside in their village and travel to the other village to celebrate Mass. Thus, a dedication event that should have brought people together in a sense of unity now threatened stability within Engelbert's diocese. With the situation quickly escalating, the bishop needed a resolution. He gathered a council of clerical and lay leaders to find a solution. Following heated debate, the result was a share time agreement. From the vigil of St. John to Christmas, Adaric was to dwell in Sai. Every day he would travel to Baltarga. During the other half of the year, he should do the opposite. With the discord at last resolved, the dedication events come to a close, as does the document. How might we connect this dispute to the belief that churches were functional spaces? The mundane particulars of diocese construction were of little concern to the congregants of the two villages. The availability of the priest, however, was a serious matter and threatened the community's ability to access its gateway to heaven. If inclement weather or illness delayed Adaric's arrival at one church or the other each day, perhaps the continuous prayer that heightened the power of the space would falter. Salvation would be jeopardized. The elaborate lustration of the consecration rite and the frequent need to reconsecrate churches following desecrations reveals just how fragile the integrity of sacred space was and how hard it was to keep the gateway open. Thus, it was vital that the priest be available to avoid a spiritual crisis. Communities took their churches and the functioning of sacred spaces quite seriously. This example from Baltarga is an early articulation of many of the Dotalia themes that scribes recorded well into the 12th century. Statements grew more specific by the turn of the millennium. A quotation from a dedication occurring in 1037 is instructive. At the village of Urus, Bishop Arabeau of Verget consecrated the church of Saint Clement. At the end of the ceremony, he explained the nature and the function of the church as a sacred space that he had created through the performance of the rite. And I quote, "We dedicate the place in which the faithful come together for prayer through the invocation of the Holy Spirit and by God's authority to advocate for all humans. What is first merely called a house, by merit, ought to be called the house of God and the doorway to heaven. For after the consecration, whoever having been heartfully inspired shall pray there through a contrite heart and penance, shall achieve remission of his sins and a full indulgence. And for this reason, I, Arabeau, by the grace of God, Bishop of Verget, with the clerics of the Church of Verget, and with many other faithful Christians, come here to this place, which is called Urus, in order to consecrate the Church of God and also the cemetery." End quote. Thus, over a century after the dedication and resultant dispute at Baltarga, a community from the same valley in the county of Sardinia continued to conceive of sanctuaries as centers for salvation. These dedications are examples of hundreds of dotalia that describe these same concerns. Liturgical commentaries, such as Quid Significant, reveal how the theologians of the 9th through the 11th centuries understood the rite and the locales within which they were performed, the higher level mean. Yet, bringing documentary sources to bear on the issue reveals that we must exercise caution in noting how influential the reformers' agenda actually was in affecting widespread belief. Dotalia documents, such as the ones described above, show that the laity and the clergy of the Spanish March were more interested in what these buildings did rather than what they meant. Thank you. Stop share.
Thanks very much, Adam. Okay, again, anyone, if you have any questions for Adam, please send me an email and we'll take those at the end. So turning now, and I have had a couple questions, so thanks for those. Turning now to Jonathan Dell'Isola. Jonathan is a PhD student at the Catholic University of America. His dissertation will focus on the reign of Arnulf of Carinthia, 887 to 899. His interests lie primarily in the political history and digital humanities. Before his time at CUA, he received an MPhil in medieval history at the University of Cambridge and a BA in history at the American University. And Jonathan will be talking to us today about competition and adaptation in the reign of Arnulf of Carinthia, 887 to 899. Okay, thank you, Jonathan.
Sure. Yeah, it's good to be here. So this paper is centered mainly on Arnulf of Carinthia, which you might have got from the title, very descriptive. So in the fall of 887, he was invited to Frankfurt by the assembled magnates of the East Frankish kingdom. And the annalist of the Annals of Fulda tells us that, quote, these men invited Arnulf, the son of King Carloman, and chose him for their lord, and without delay decided that he should be made king. The men had chosen Arnulf over his uncle, the Emperor Charles the Fat. Charles's empire had spanned modern-day France, Germany, and northern Italy. And here I've just kind of created a little map of some of the kind of the major centers that I'm going to be referencing and might come up in the presentation today, just so you're kind of familiar with some of the geography. A descendant of Charlemagne, Charles was the last member of the dynasty known to historians as the Carolingians to rule over the entire empire. Arnulf had a more complicated dynastic connection. His father was a Carolingian king, but was not married to Arnulf's mother. As such, modern historiography has emphasized Arnulf's illegitimacy. Simon MacLean argued that because of his birth status, quote, Arnulf did not have enough credibility to be able to take over control of the whole empire of his uncle. MacLean was building on the work of Stuart Airlie, who argued that the Carolingians had effectively created an image of royalty that centered on a legitimate male Carolingian. If we put aside this question of Arnulf's legitimacy, because ideals of marriage were still fluid at this point, what can we understand about politics after 887? That is, in a kind of a post-Carolingian era, what role did Arnulf play? New kings arose in West Francia, Burgundy, and Italy who were not members of the dynasty. Arnulf would also have to contend with an internal revolt in 890 by his cousin Bernard, and the eastern frontier would prove a constant source of tension. Arnulf has been seen as refounding the East Frankish kingdom, which his grandfather, Louis the German, had originally established during his own long reign. And so here I give you a kind of a simplified Carolingian genealogy because there's quite a lot of these Louis and Carlomans and Charleses, but these are kind of the main ones that I'm going to reference and touch upon so you have an idea of kind of, the relationship to each other. Eric Goldberg argues that the nobility of East Francia chose Arnulf in part to maintain the coherence of the kingdom, as they had grown accustomed to the kind of the patronage the king had provided. However, under Arnulf, there still remained localized networks of political power in the different regions of his kingdom, which suggests that this coherence could exist alongside a more regionalized aristocracy. Importantly, this does not mean that Arnulf was just kind of one of the members of the aristocracy, but was still able to be elevated above them. This paper is going to look at three regions, Lotharingia, Alemannia, and the frontier, and in doing so, we can see that Arnulf was able to activate and reinforce these localized networks in response to competition from both external forces under Rudolf and Zwentebald and internal dissent. Soon after Arnulf became king, he received word that Rudolf, an important magnate in Burgundy, had declared himself king in both Burgundy and Lotharingia. Reginald of Prüm, writing in the early 10th century, notes that Rudolf sent men through Lotharingia in order to persuade the nobility, quote, by persuasions and promises, to support him as king. This was directly in opposition to Arnulf, because the East Frankish kingdom had controlled Lotharingia since the Treaty of Riedmont in 880. Rudolf's maneuverings prompted a quick response from Arnulf. He mobilized for war. Beyond this, Arnulf also issued several charters to Lotharingian recipients. Many of these charters went to important regional figures and institutions. There are charters issued for Prüm, Trier, St. Mary in Aachen, and St. Arnulf in Metz, for example. Arnulf's first charter was granted to Archbishop Luitbert of Mainz, who had been the arch-chaplain for both Louis the German, who was Arnulf's grandfather, and Louis the Younger, who was Arnulf's uncle. Then, 10 days after Charles the Fat's death in 888, Arnulf granted a charter for St. Maximin in Trier. The intercessor was Megengos, who was a count in the region and nepos of the West Frankish king Odo. He became influential under Louis the German in the 850s, and he would remain close to Arnulf until his assassination in 892, which Matthew Inez argued was prompted because of his ability to control access to the king a bit too successfully. It seems that some of these charters were meant to reinforce Arnulf's dynastic claims to authority in the region, because they emphasize Arnulf's lineage. In the charter for Prüm, Arnulf confirms the privileges of several of his ancestors, and the specific relationship is identified. Pippin, the Carolingian who refounded the monastery, is Atavus Noster, Charlemagne is Pro-Avus Noster, and Louis the German is Avus Noster. And you can see on the slide, I've kind of put that in there. So you can kind of get a sense of where these terms are fitting into their family tree. A pair of charters, one from 888 and one from 889 for Trier and St. Peter in Trier, also list a large number of Carolingian monarchs. Importantly, these charters were not only about confirming past grants, but also about commemorating the memory of Arnulf's ancestors. Thus, Louis the German is Aulus, while Carloman is Genitor, and Louis the Younger and Charles the Fat are both Patros. That is, the purpose of the grant was not only to reconfirm past deeds, but to emphasize Arnulf's own connection to his Carolingian ancestors. The charters for Lotharingia reveal Arnulf engaging with important institutions and individuals. By creating connections with these groups, Arnulf was able to secure his own authority in the region. It was through individuals such as Megangos that Arnulf could underwrite his own power locally. Simon MacLean and Matthew Inez saw this as a reflection of Arnulf's inability to project power into Lotharingia, and that he was thus required to utilize local elites in order to rule. However, all royal power was modulated through local elites. Even in Arnulf's main areas of support, Carinthia and Bavaria, we still see Arnulf relying on local networks to maintain authority. This does not reflect royal weakness, but was a reflection of a function of early medieval government, where consensus formed an important part of ruling. Indeed, Arnulf could and did rearrange his relationships with elites. It is hard to see Hatto's elevation as Archbishop of Mainz as anything other than Arnulf installing his own preferred candidate there, while, as we will see in Alemannia and Bavaria, Arnulf could confiscate land and revoke honores from treacherous nobles. Likewise, these charters, in response to Rudolf and Arnulf's own ascension, were a way for him to create new political relationships with Lotharingia. In Alemannia and Bavaria, we see a similar process at work. In 890, Arnulf granted land to Hatto, the abbot of Reichenau, and the future Archbishop of Mainz, who I mentioned above, which had belonged to a certain Odalric and his wife, because they had committed, quote, offense against our royal majesty, meaning Arnulf. Unfortunately, the charter does not say what they had done, but the likely context was the revolt of Bernard. Bernard, the son of Charles the Fat, had a troubled history before 890. Charles sought to have him legitimized twice, but both times the attempt failed. The narrative sources rarely mention the revolt. Only an elusive comment in the Annales Alemannici notes that, quote, Bernard, the son of Charles, barely escaped the nets, meaning that he evaded capture, and that he was killed sometime in 891 or 892. While the lack of narrative coverage may make it seem like the revolt was inconsequential, the charters reveal a different impression. There were more confiscations as well, but we only hear of them during the reign of Arnulf's son, when some of their lands were restored. As mentioned above, Arnulf confiscated land because of Odalric's offenses, and it seems Arnulf intervened to remove the abbot of St. Gall, confusingly also named Bernard, because he supported the revolt. A charter from 892 notes that because, quote, our serenity was disturbed to such a degree, the abbot Bernard was removed, and Solomon, our faithful chaplain, was put in his place. Likewise, Arnulf granted a charter for Egino, who is a count in Thuringia. The land was located in the area near Reichenau, which suggests that Arnulf was attempting to foster some cross-regional ties so that Egino would be more likely to support Arnulf in the region. More broadly, some of Arnulf's earliest charters to Alemannia seem to have been done in the interest of securing Arnulf's authority there. Alemannia had been Charles the Fat's power base, so establishing his own authority there would have been crucial for Arnulf. Indeed, Arnulf's first charter, as mentioned above, was an exchange with Lupert of Mainz, and after Lupert's death, the land was to go to Hatto, whom we saw above. Hatto was a critical figure at Arnulf's court. He intervened in 14 charters, more than anyone else. Between 887 and 892, there are 4 other charters which can be directly connected to Hatto. 3 which went to Reichenau, and 1 which granted land to Hatto himself. This is not necessarily a new argument. Gerd Tellenbach argued that Arnulf used Hatto and Solomon, the abbot Arnulf installed at St. Gall mentioned above, to control the, quote, unruly Alemannic tribal territory. However, the instability of Alemannia was not because of the Alemannians themselves, but because of the region's strong connections to Charles. Further, Rudolf was also likely involved with the magnates there, because he was able to negotiate with the Alemannians themselves in order to secure himself passage to see Arnulf in 888. Many of these charters testify to connections between Arnulf and important Alemannic figures. In early 888, only 9 days after Charles the Fat's death, Arnulf issued a charter for Chur, which confirmed a charter that Charles the Fat had originally given to Luitward of Vercelli. The Bishop of Chur brought this charter to Arnulf in order to have the land transferred. 6 days later, Arnulf would confirm another grant of Charles, this time to a priest named Rodpert. The two intercessors here were the bishops of Passau and Freising. By confirming these grants, Arnulf not only indicated his continuity with Charles and his own ascension as king, but also created a relationship with these bishops. As in Lotharingia, Arnulf used the charters in order to secure the support of important regional magnates and institutions. Individuals such as Hatto were able to move across regional lines, operating in both Lotharingia and Alemannia. Likewise, Arnulf could foster cross-regional ties by granting land such as he did with Egino. Beyond Alemannia and Lotharingia, Arnulf also had to deal with affairs along the eastern frontier. The Slavs, led by Zwentibald, had been a constant source of tension since the 880s and before, when Arnulf is seen as a military commander in the region. Arnulf had strong personal connections as well. His son was named after this Slavic leader, Zwentibald. Because Arnulf's son was born around 871, this means that Arnulf had a connection with the Slavic Zwentibald that lasted about 16 years before he became king in 887. Early in his reign, Arnulf granted extensive rights to a certain Haimo to defend the border along with the marcher count Arbo. Arbo and Arnulf had been opponents in the 880s when Arnulf had supported the spurned counts Willem and Engelschalk. Arbo had gotten the support of Zwentibald and Charles the Fat to bolster his own position during the conflict. As such, it is possible that Arnulf gave these rights in 888 in order to counterbalance Arbo's power. Haimo had probably been an early supporter of Arnulf's bid for the throne because both he and his wife Miltrude were rewarded with charters early in his reign. Additionally, Haimo had cross-border connections with the Slavic Principality in Moravia, reflecting a trend in the 9th century of increased connections between Franco-Bavarian and Moravian elites. In early 892, Arnulf set out to meet with the Dutch Zwentibald, quote, but in the usual fashion, he refused to come to the king and feigned fidelity and all the things he had promised previously. As such, Arnulf prepared to lead a military expedition against Zwentibald. Despite few charters referencing the Slavs directly, the charters given to Bavarian recipients in 891 to 893 likely represent Arnulf's continued efforts to maintain control of the frontier. And you can kind of see, this is a map of recipients of Arnulf's charters from those years. And you can see that, there's St. Metten, there's Passau, there's St. Florian, and Kremsmünster, which are all located along the Danube River. And so controlling the river would have been vital for any potential military expeditions to the southeast. Boy. Many of the charters given in this region represent Arnulf's attempts to organize control of the frontier, as we saw with the earlier charter of Haimo in 888. Thiotmar, the Archbishop of Salzburg and the Archchaplain to Arnulf, seems to have also been crucial to Arnulf's control of the region. Salzburg received 2 charters in 891, with Thiotmar appearing as the intercessor both times. Later, in April 892, Arnulf granted land to a, quote, vassal of Thiotmar. Additionally, Thiotmar was the attested archchaplain in all of Arnulf's charters between 887 and 891. Becoming archbishop in the 870s, Thiotmar had been an important fixture at Carloman's court as well, which was his father. Thiotmar was no stranger to military conflict as well. He would be killed at the Battle of Pressburg in 907. In a different charter, in October of 893, Arnulf confiscated land from Wilhelm and Engelschalk because of their infidelity to the king. While the charter itself does not tell us why, the Annals of Fulda provide some additional context. Engelschalk had recently been reconciled with the king after he had been placed in exile in Moravia, and he was subsequently made Margrave in the east. Engelschalk was then blinded by angry nobles later in the year, while Wilhelm was killed on the orders of Zwentibald. It seems that affairs on the frontier were fluid, because Wilhelm and Engelschalk's ancestors, mentioned above, were previously supported by Arnulf in the 880s. Further, Engelschalk could also both be exiled and return from exile. The confiscated land was given to Kremsmünster, whose abbot Snelpero seems to have been an important early supporter of Arnulf, because he received 3 grants of land between January 888 and May 889, while Kremsmünster received 2 charters in 888. The aim of the charters in this region therefore seemed to correspond with impending military expeditions, and the need to organize the frontier in response to Zwentibol's movements in the 890s. Having been involved with the frontier for several decades, Arnulf was seeking to install his own men and supporters to help him oversee the region. By relying on several key individuals and institutions, Arnulf was securing both loyalty and logistical checkpoints on his routes to the conflict. In these 3 regions, the charters went to key institutions and supporters, but they were reacting to different circumstances. Historians have argued that over the course of the 9th century, East Francia developed into a distinct political community under Louis the German and Louis the Younger. Matthias Becker saw Louis the Younger as an orientation point for the kingdom, which integrated the Franks and Saxons. Eric Goldberg, in discussing the reign of Louis the German, argued that through his reforms he helped to create a distinct East Frankish kingdom, when it had previously been a periphery of the Carolingian Empire. What Arnulf's early years demonstrate is that despite this work of integrating, the East Frankish kingdom still retained a somewhat regional character. Few individuals in Arnulf's charters were present in multiple regions, with the exception of incredibly important individuals such as Hatto, who was involved in Lotharingia, Alemannia, and even Italy, which I didn't get a chance to talk about today. Instead, the charters were targeted at institutions and individuals that were important regionally. Roman Deutinger has argued that by the late 9th century, kings had become so dependent on consensus that it is not possible to disentangle royal policy from aristocratic agendas. However, the relative independence of these regions suggests that there were multiple competing aristocratic agendas that were then balanced by the king. 888 is often used as a decisive breakpoint for changing politics in the late 9th century. For instance, Charles West argued that it represented the point when kingship became less intensive in Lotharingia, and that the elites may have, quote, opted out of Carolingian rule because they no longer depended on the court for their own social standing. What we see from Arnulf's charters, however, is that Lotharingia continued to matter, and that the elite had an interest in seeking out Arnulf's patronage. Likewise, Simon MacLean saw 888 as the start of the, quote, long 10th century. On the other hand, it is important not to overstate this regionalism. Individuals and institutions could and did move across regional lines, operating in Lotharingia, Bavaria, Alemannia, and Saxony. Synods were one avenue for trans-regional relationships. The Synod of Mainz in 888, which claimed to be held, quote, for the most glorious king, Arnulf, and also for his glorious wife, and also for the state of all Christianity, had the bishops of Reims, Salzburg, Trier, Vercelli, Würzburg, Metz, Freising, and others in attendance, so quite a big council. The Synod of Triber in 895 also had an extensive group of bishops. Likewise, assemblies remained a venue for integrating these different regions, such as the assemblies held at Frankfurt in 888 and Forsheim in 889. These assemblies and synods were intended to strengthen the kingdom or to reform church practices, which was in and of itself a kingdom-wide project. In 892, when Arnulf set out to attack Zwentibold, 3 armies were tasked with invading Moravia, and Arnulf himself brought an army composed of Alemannians, Bavarians, and Franks. Taken together, this suggests that when it came to granting charters, Arnulf operated mainly along regional lines, but that he could also bring together the varying regions in order to accomplish other goals. Arnulf's coup did usher in a new period of European history, but for the time being, politics in East Francia did not yet resemble those of the 10th century. Arnulf had to contend with competition from a variety of places, but was able to mobilize the resources of the kingdom, done through regions, in order to maintain his authority. To return to the question posed at the beginning of this paper, what can we understand about post-887 politics? It is important to note that Arnulf's reign was characterized by competition, in a way that no other Carolingian monarch had ever faced up to this point. Arnulf's competition stemmed from the changed nature of broader European politics. Carolingians no longer ruled everywhere. On the other hand, however, Arnulf followed in the footsteps of his Carolingian predecessors, who also had sought to intervene in Italy and had to defend the frontier from Slavic invasions. Arnulf's reign, instead of being a simple gateway into the, quote, long 10th century, was instead a time of dynamic political change, as East Francia under Arnulf had to adapt and compete with changed circumstances. Reginald, writing to the court of Arnulf's son Louis, remarked that, quote, he alone of such a multitude of kings was come upon as suitable for posterity, that he should take up the scepter of the rule of the Franks. Obviously, Reginald seemed to have great things in mind for Arnulf, but he's writing in hindsight. Similarly, the anonymous Saxon poet, writing in the 890s, would ask Saint Arnulf, the saintly ancestor of the Carolingians and King Arnulf's namesake, to watch over Arnulf. The chaos of the preceding years and the dwindling of the dynasty had left only one person left to restore the empire, Arnulf, the only just king. So in kind of conclusion, where I'm going with this all is that Arnulf really had a kind of a chance to do something, and he's adapting to all these things. And in the end, he ends up being able to work regionally. And so if you have any questions, I have my, I have one more slide, I thought. Well, maybe not. But I have my Twitter handle in the beginning of these slides, which I can go back to. So if you're interested, get in contact with me. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Okay, I guess we can all come back for the question portion. So, right, I'm gonna sort of take these questions I've received as they come to me. The first one is in fact a kind of general question that I'm not sure about, which comes from Heather Scanlon, asking if the papers are going to be available to download or review anywhere. So I suspect that's kind of individual to you guys as speakers. I don't think that the conference is hosting them as documents anywhere. But anyone who knows, feel free to correct me if that's wrong. I'm not aware of it. So I suppose the best thing to do would be email you individually if you were interested in that. Okay, so then next I have a question for each of you from Manu Radhakrishnan. And he, starting with Helen, okay, he asks, did Sir John Prise make a selection of manuscripts and books at each monastic establishment and leave others behind? Do we know whether he had porters who removed the selections and whether he marked the ones to be sent to Henry and those he intended to keep?
Oh, some good questions. I don't think we know what he left behind exactly. I think we know that he took most of the manuscripts that he knew or had been told that Henry wouldn't want for the Royal Library. So they were the ones that were copies or more obscure or not very nice manuscripts. You know, they weren't luxury manuscripts. Anyone who's ever visited the British Library or seen online any of the Royal Collection, what's still called the Royal Collection, you'll know that those are the most gorgeous manuscripts, fully illuminated, luxury bindings, all the rest of it, very prestige texts, romances, that kind of thing. So those were the ones that were identified by people like John Leland as ones that Henry would want for his own library, for the Royal Collection. So the ones, apart from that, the ones that were left, Sir John Prise took the ones that interested him the most. So he was interested in theology, in history, and in literary texts, particularly texts in Welsh. So like all collectors, he had his own sort of priorities about what he was looking for and what he wanted to collect. So he almost certainly didn't take the entire contents of each monastic library, but he would have taken all the books that he would have wanted for his own collection and that he thought were worth saving, that he didn't want to see destroyed. He would have had a lot of servants with him who could have carried the books away in carts, you know, horse and cart would have taken the books away. So yes, he would have had servants to do that work for him.
As you said in your paper, thank goodness he did. Okay, So thanks for that. I have some maybe a follow-up, but let's go on then to, oops, sorry. Okay, Adam, Manu asks, why is significant in quid significant in the subjunctive mood rather than the indicative? Is it a question, and if so, does it need a question mark? Also, wasn't continuous prayer a monastic function rather than that of a parish priest?
Okay, thank you. As to the quid significant title, I don't readily know. That's a very interesting question that I definitely will look into more specifically. And yes, the concept of like continuous prayer is a more typically associated with monastic practices. However, like the offices are ongoing in the Spanish March and these parish churches during the day. That's why it's important for there to be an established priest available, and many of the consecration documents do talk about like the accessibility of the priests for like daily services. But yes, that is more a monastic thing, and the documents do not mention those words specifically. That was more my putting that in there, but yes, I take that point.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and then one for Jonathan, which Dr. Radhakrishnan says is more of a comment. He says he thinks that Retitia is a place name in Bavaria, and he gives you a reference to Grassa in Orbis Latinus, which is Retitia, Resia. I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of these, sorry. I could forward that to you if you like.
Yeah, it's possible. It could be the place name too. It's possible. Yeah, it's a good point. But the overall point, which is that he basically is like escaping, and then he gets killed in this kind of like region that's not in Alemannia is the main takeaway. But yeah, that's a good point.
Myriah, you need to unmute your microphone.
Thank you, Helen. Sorry. Okay. So this is from Elizabeth Teviotdale for Adam. Sorry. And she says that there will be more pertinent questions, but we'll take this one. And she asks, does the quid significant offer commentary on the significance of the substances involved, so ash, wine, etc., and of the changes in substances involved as the church is consecrated?
The commentary itself mentions them, and they symbolize certain like Old Testament values, if I believe correctly. I need to go back and look at that a little bit closer. But it doesn't talk about how it's related to specific spaces exactly. But yeah, I know her. I might write to her with a more specific answer. Yeah, when I check. Thank you.
Okay, grand. Maybe I should stop unmuting myself. I can't remember to do it. Okay, another question for Helen. This is from William Campbell. And he asks, did Sir John Prise acquire any manuscripts other than those from closing monastic houses? The catalogue for the National Library of Wales suggests that he acquired the Black Book of Carmarthen from Hugh Price, treasurer of St. David's, who was his old Oxford classmate. Not actually, it's the treasurer of St. David's, I think, is somebody else. Sorry, that's me interjecting. Did he acquire any manuscripts from the secular Welsh cathedral libraries?
Yes, he did. He did acquire at least a couple from St. David's. There's a copy of the Annales Cambriae that came from St. David's. And the Black Book of Carmarthen probably came either from St. David's or from a gentry family in that area. And he certainly was in touch with all the big gentry families along the march. And, you know, probably did handle, well, we know he handled the Red Book of Herges, for example. So, yeah, he would have had a number of manuscripts from gentry houses, as well as the monastic libraries. In the catalogue of his manuscripts that was made by Neil Kerr, Kerr focused mainly on the ones that came from monastic libraries. but we think that there are a lot more to be found that would have come from gentry libraries, and that's one aspect of our project, is to look at the links between Sir John Prise and the big gentry families who we know had libraries, people like the Vaughans and other people like that. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was going to say that I thought it's John Lewis was the treasurer at the time, but I did want to ask you, Helen, if I could sort of piggyback onto that. Did John Prise treat his annotation differently depending on the type of manuscript, like a theological or historical, or even the language of the manuscript? Because I work on the Black Book of Carmarthen as my PhD topic. Some of you may not know. A lot of you may not know. And I find it interesting, in that manuscript, we have a lot of annotation for different people, and some of it's been erased. But anyhow, Sir John Prise doesn't seem to have left any annotation in that manuscript, which is quite interesting to me. So yeah, does he treat maybe the Welsh manuscripts differently, or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't made a huge study of all his annotations. I've just had a look at some of them. And I think clearly the ones in the historical manuscripts are the ones where he really goes to town, because he's most interested in the British history. And he's doing a lot of research for his book, the book that became the Defence of British History. He's going through his manuscript collection and making annotations, which he will then use as part of his argument in his defence of British history. So a lot of the annotations in the historical manuscripts, whether it's Bede or Nennius or Geoffrey or whatever, those annotations are quite specific on, you know, this reinforces my point about Arthur or whatever. You know, it's like what students do when they annotate photocopies of material that they're going to be using in their essays. It's exactly that kind of thing. Whereas I think in the Red Book of Hergest, it's more to do with the language. He was very interested in Welsh grammar, Welsh linguistics, and of course knew quite a lot about it. So the annotations in the Red Book are more to do with the language or the text, you know, oh, a copy of this poem is also found in X manuscript or whatever. So it's to do much more with the text themselves and the language. It is interesting that he doesn't seem to have anything in the Black Book. It suggests that that probably wasn't with him for very long. I think that's probably the explanation.
Yeah, I think he probably was a borrower rather than owner for
a
couple of reasons. Yeah. Great, thank you. Okay, let me just check and see if there's anything else that's come in. Sorry, slow to load. Or if any of the panelists have questions for any other speakers, if we kind of want to cross-examine one another. Ooh. Yes. Okay. I don't have any further emails. I have a question for Jonathan, purely out of ignorance. I suppose I don't know anything about your subject. I'm sorry. So I was wondering, I saw the emphasis in the charters around particular rivers and things. Did Arnulf issue more charters than other rulers, or was there, you know, a sort of higher rate or anything like that?
Yeah, so there's a bit of a problem with Arnulf's charters, which is that he issues about 175 of them, give or take a couple, depending on how you want to count them or like how fragmentary they are, which is about the same as his grandfather and Charles the Fat, who's his uncle. They both issue about the same amount. What's weird is that Arnulf issues about 90 of them in the first like couple of years of his reign. So what you see with Arnulf is you see like a lot of charters right at the beginning and then like much less after that, which is very unusual. I think in the first year of his reign, he redacts about 40 charters, whereas most other Carolingian rulers do about 8. So it's about like 5 times as many. So part of what I'm trying to figure out is like, you know, why is there this like explosion of charters at the beginning of his reign? And I think part of it is this kind of response to competition and this like new kind of broader European politics that's about him defending his authority in a way that the other Carolingians might not have had to do.
Interesting, great. I've learned a lot today from all of you. Okay.
Actually, Myriah, I did have a quick question for Adam, if there's still time. I think we still have a couple of minutes to go.
Yeah.
Adam, I was really interested in your discussion of sacred space and the way in which the church and the outside of the church was used, and how the laity had to stand outside for quite a significant part of the ritual which was going on inside the church. And I wondered whether that was sort of ideological, that what was going on in the church was somehow particularly sacred or private or had to be done by just members of the church, or whether it's simply practical that they couldn't fit everybody into the church.
So a great many of the consecrations, with the dedication events, of which the consecration is a particular part, lasts for about 2 days, and they can last all day. They're really long. There's 150 distinct actions for many consecration rites, and they just do last all day. And there's like a vigil overnight that the laity can come and like hang out with the relics in the little tabernacle tent outside of the church before it's brought in. They are often outside observing the cathedral clergy singing litanies around the relics, while the bishop goes in with generally just 1 or 2 helpers to help him carry instruments, and he circles the church with his little little consecration party, and then they go inside and do things. The laity have a function, and it seems to be more witnessing the church become a new space. But there is this kind of secretive notion about what's going on at the inside, the most holy part of the church. And you would think that then the bishop would come out and explain, okay, this is what I did inside, because, in the practical sense, they couldn't all fit in. These churches are quite small. But he's really concerned mostly about them misbehaving in the church, and then therefore ruining the sacrality of the space by contaminating it with amoral action. So it's mostly, the only time he really talks to them is at the very end, when he yells at them about, like not upkeeping the church or damaging it or swearing inside of it or doing other like licentious activity inside of it. And then he does invite everybody to kind of crowd in for the inaugural mass. So yeah, it's the laity's role is very amorphous. It's just they don't really see the parts that if the rite communicates Reformed liturgy concepts, they're not really witnessing the bulk of that on the interior, which means I don't really think it's that much of a didactic experience. It seems more functional and practical in nature.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much. I think we're at time. Thank you all once again. We don't have an audience that can clap, but thank you very much. Thank you to the attendees. If I can point you back to the Medieval Academy of America website and the program, there are more sessions later today, and there's a meeting, I think, tomorrow as well. Thank you all.
Thanks, Myriah. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.